so good to be here. Like you all know, I'm talking about standardized testing today, and particularly the ACT and the SAT. So first off, a little bit about me, just so you kind of have a background. I'm from Bethesda, Maryland, which is right outside of Washington, D.C. in the United States. I just graduated high school, and I'll be attending the University of Pennsylvania, majoring in economics in the Wharton School of Business. I graduated from an IB program in my high school, which, if you don't know, is the International Baccalaureate program. And some of my interests or hobbies include art, dance, debate, journalism, and community service. So just as a quick introduction, if you ever have a question about something specific, you can stop me and ask it, or you can just leave your questions in the chat and I'll get to them at the end. So first off, the basics. Usually when we talk about standardized testing, we mainly think of SAT and the ACT, but I'm also going to be talking a little bit about the AP exams and SAT subject tests because those are also considered standardized tests. So a really quick disclaimer, which I think I have to give just because of how unusual our circumstances are. I know that the pandemic and COVID is affecting a lot of testing availability. A lot of test centers are not open. And so some of my tips and advice might have to be tweaked based off of where you are and how available tests are. Another thing to notice is that if you are a rising senior, if you're applying to college this year, a lot of schools, almost all of the top 20 are becoming test optional, meaning they don't require the SAT or the ACT. If you already have those scores, that's great and you can send them. But if you can't get the test for whatever reason, then don't stress. And in general, there's just a movement that a lot of schools are becoming test optional because there is a kind of backlash and movement against standardized testing. Another thing is that I'm not really going to be talking about the basics of what sections and the timing and the specifics of each test because you can find that information with a really quick Google search, but I will be mainly focusing on tips and what I've learned and what I think I would have wanted to know. So my biggest overall standardized testing tip that applies across the board for all the exams is that you want to not just know the material and the content of the test, but also the test itself, what they specifically are asking for and how each test differs in what they're looking for. So for example, for the AP English literature test, you might be really, really good at writing essays and analyzing texts, but for their last essay question, you have to pull from a specific list of books, and if you haven't read those books, if you haven't studied those books, you will not be able to do well. So it's more than learning just the content, you have to really study the format of each test. Okay, so I want to start off with AP exams, which if you're in the United States, you've probably heard about or thought about. And this mainly applies to those of you who are rising freshmen and sophomore and juniors, because if you're a rising senior, you don't really have to worry about AP exams at this point. But there are definitely a lot of pros and cons to AP tests. So the main pros are that they show that you're willing to challenge yourself. So AP or advanced placement tests are higher level exams. They're meant to mimic college level courses. And so by taking these exams and these courses, it shows that you're willing to challenge yourself and they look really good on your transcript because they are higher level courses. Additionally, certain exams will give you college credit or let you opt out of basic courses, for example, English 101 at specific universities. Some of the cons are that not all high schools offer a wide range of AP exams, which is totally fine. I think a lot of people get concerned because they aren't physically able to take these classes or these exams, but just keep in mind that you're going to be compared when you're applying to college. You're being compared against people in your school, against people in your district, and so that's all going to be taken into account. Another thing is that not all universities accept a lot of AP credits. In fact, many of them don't accept too many. So for example, I'll show you my exam soon, but I'm only using about 2 credits from my high school AP exams that I can actually apply to college because the University of Pennsylvania doesn't accept too many. The last thing that is important to keep in mind is that they are a lot of work, especially during exam season, which is around April, May. That's also the same season that most schools have finals. And so you have to keep in mind the amount of work and the amount of stress that you personally can handle, all condensed into a very specific and short period of time. So you don't want to be taking 5 or 6 exams in 1 year because they all happen within the same few weeks. Okay, so I wanted to give a kind of sample of what one student might look like. These are the AP exams that I took, and I do recognize that it looks like a lot, and that is because the culture of my school was that most students took 7 to 10 AP exams, if not more, throughout their high school experience. But again, like I said before, that's totally dependent on what your school's culture is and what the availability is of the exams at your school. So my freshman year, I took Chinese because I already knew the language going into it. I didn't really have to do too much extra work for it, and I definitely didn't take the class in school. I basically just prepared for the exam on my own at home. So all the tests that I have italicized, I called self-study tests because they're exams that I studied from by myself at home without a class. And then because I took the US government class in school, I also took that exam. My sophomore year, I took US history and statistics because those were classes that I took in school. And so I didn't have to do that much studying by myself because my school class prepared me for them. But then I also decided to self-study AP Computer Science A and AP Psychology by myself because I had some free time that year. And I thought those were 2 relevant exams that I wanted to complete. But were they necessary? Also probably not. For my junior year, I took both English tests. So if you're not too familiar, there are 2 AP English exams they offer. One is language and one is literature. And my school's English class kind of covered English literature, but for language, I basically studied it by myself. It was not too much extra work because I was always pretty comfortable with reading comprehension and writing. My main 2 AP exams for junior year were BC Calculus and Physics, but again, those were classes that I took in school. And then my senior year, I had signed up for and I planned to take both microeconomics and macroeconomics because I was taking the class in school. But because the year ended so early and all the exams were online and I had already gotten into college at that point, I ended up not taking those exams. But that was the plan if the year continued normally. And then in blue, I highlighted statistics and BC Calculus. These are the only 2 exams that I'm getting credit for at UPenn. So for statistics, I don't have to take Statistics 101. I can take 110, which is the next level up. And for BC Calculus, I just don't have to take any more math classes in college because I have that credit. Okay, so really quickly, just a couple of my biggest AP exam tips. I would say only self-study for exams if you are definitely committed to and have the time to do it. So even if you think you are pretty well versed in the subject, getting to know the exam, getting to know the format and the questions they like to ask still takes a lot of time. So please keep that in mind. It's not really reasonable or feasible to study, like self-study, like 5 different exams in 1 year. So just keep that in mind. If you are deciding to self-study, please start as early as possible, ideally the beginning of the year. For example, for AP Computer Science that I self-studied, I started it in the fall and I paced myself through the material as if I were taking the class. Another thing is to figure out how much your class in school is preparing you for the exam. So for certain classes like AP Calculus, my teacher did a really good job of spending the last couple of months solely dedicated to preparing us for the exam. We did practice tests, we went over questions and things like that. So I didn't have to do too much work outside of class. But if you're just taking a normal math class, you might have to study a lot more. Either way, no matter which exam you're taking, no matter how much you're studying in class, start studying on your own at home by the latest of spring break, which I'd say is like around March, because you still want at least a month or 2 to really get to know the exam and study it. In terms of resources, I use the most prep books for AP exams. And a lot of people ask which one is the best book. In general, there are three big brands or companies that do these books. There's Barron's, Princeton Review, and 5 Steps to a 5. You basically can't go wrong with these books, but if you want to, you can go online, and sometimes people will recommend certain books over others depending on which subject, so it totally varies. Another thing is to make sure your book is up to date. There's definitely nothing wrong with getting a used book because these books can be pretty pricey and you don't want to waste your money, but you have to make sure that it's up to date. These exams like to change a lot in terms of their format, the types of questions they ask. So just double check online when was the last time that the test was redesigned, and make sure your book is up to date. Another thing is that for the bigger exams, you can definitely find a lot of practice exams online just by doing a quick Google search. So if you just want more practice outside of your book. And the last thing is Quizlet, or any sort of vocabulary list, vocabulary study. For most of the exams, especially things like psychology or statistics, there's a lot of memorization involved. So just having Quizlet on my phone, where if I was on the bus or if I was waiting for someone for like 10 to 20 minutes, that I could just look over it, that was really, really helpful, just to always have something that you can study so you're not carrying around the books all the time. And these are just my last few little commonly asked questions about the AP exams. So I've gotten asked what are the easiest exams to self-study if you're looking to get a certain number of exams. While I don't recommend just studying an exam for the number, I personally think the easiest one is psychology. That's what most people do. It's basically just memorization. Another thing is if you have native languages that you know, for example, if you're a native Chinese speaker or a native Spanish speaker, it could be a good idea to take those exams. And lastly, if you are a native English speaker, the language and literature exams should be pretty easy. My next tip, I would say, is a bit controversial, but it's something that I truly believe in and is tried and true for me, which is that I think the College Board believes quantity over quality in terms of AP exams, meaning that they really appreciate when you write longer essays. And I found this to be true because I've taken multiple exams, especially the SAT, where I wrote an essay that I thought was well thought out. I planned it and wrote it, but it was only about 1.5 pages. And then the next time I wrote a really long essay that it wasn't as well planned out, wasn't as well written, but it was like 4 pages long, and I got a better score. And that's not to say that all graders will do this, but these graders are spending very, very few time reading your essays because they have so much to do and so much to get through that a lot of times if they just skim through your essay and it looks good and you have a lot written, they'll tend to give you a better score. Again, take this with a grain of salt. You still want to be writing high quality answers, but you also don't want to spend too much time planning and doing graphic organizers in the beginning. The last thing is about AP exam awards. These are awards that you get for doing well in exams. The highest one that most people aim for is the National AP Scholar Award, which is where you get 4 or 5 on at least 8 exams. The next level is the AP Scholar with Distinction, which is an average of at least 3.5 exams, 3.5 on all your exams, and 5 or more exams where you have a score of 3 or higher. So if you are looking for academic awards that you want to get, this is definitely an award that you can aim for. You can aim towards this award like all 3 to 4 years of your high school career, and it's not anything that you have to do additionally. Okay, so moving on to what I feel like most people are here for, which is the SAT and ACT exams. So I wanted to start off by kind of talking about the difference between the two, which one to take, etc. So here are, from my experience and from the research that I've done, the main differences between these exams. The first one is that the SAT doesn't have a science section. It has reading, math, and writing, which is basically grammar, and the essay section. The ACT has reading, math, writing, or grammar, and a science section and the essay. So that's a big difference. But I also want to say that their science is another extension of reading. I like to say that it's just reading, but about a scientific subject. Because how their science section is organized is that they give you a passage or an article about a scientific topic, and then you have to answer questions based off of it. But they're never going to directly ask you a technical question that you have to know the answer to. Okay, another thing is that the SAT gives you more time per question, meaning that within 60 minutes you have more time for each question, so less questions total. The ACT, people will often say you have to move a lot faster because there's more questions to get through. So that's something where you have to think about your personal skills and your personal preferences. Another thing is that the SAT has a no calculator math section, whereas the ACT, you can use your calculator for all the math questions. There's also generally more of an emphasis on geometry in the ACT. The SAT focuses a lot more on algebra. And last thing is that their essays ask for two completely different things. So the SAT essay is about dissecting an author's argument. You're reading a text and you're explaining how the author developed their argument. The ACT is a lot more personal opinion. There's no reading. It's like a prompt, and you just answer it based off of what you think and all of your background knowledge. So those are kind of the main differences between the exams. And which one you take is totally up to you. So in the past, maybe like a decade ago, schools tended to prefer an SAT, but nowadays almost every single school will take both exams. They don't have a preference for either one. So it's totally up to you. You just have to figure out which one you prefer. So here I also have a rough timeline. Now this is, like I said, just a rough timeline. It's also an average timeline of what most students do. And it's by no means a guide you have to follow, but it's something that I think works well. So I would say to take your first SAT or ACT in August of your junior year, because that gives you the entire summer to study. And then it also gives you an entire year to retake the exam if you want to. The beauty about SAT and ACT is they both allow you to retake as many times as you want. So if you take it in August, you didn't do as well as you thought, you can take it again in November or even in February of next year, etc. And then another thing is to start sending in your scores by September of your senior year. So it's not really feasible to take the exam again in the fall of your senior year. You should be done by summer because most schools want you to send the official score report to them, and College Board takes weeks up to months to send those scores. And so you really don't want to send them like a week before your application is due, because that can stop your application from being accepted by the school. So I got the question, what is a good SAT score? A very valid question, but again, subjective. So I got this source, this table on the right here from the Prep Scholar blog, and it basically gives an average SAT score of the top 15-ish schools in the country. So a few things to keep in mind when we're talking about good scores is that the SAT, the ACT is only one small portion of your application. So there are so many other things that you're being evaluated on. If you don't do as well on one thing, but you have really outstanding extracurriculars, for example, that would totally give you a boost, and it doesn't matter if you don't do as well. It also varies depending on your goals and the schools you're applying to. So like I said, these are the top 15 universities in the country. They're all highly, highly competitive. If you're not aiming that high, that's totally fine. And you can just look up the school that you are planning on applying to and seeing their average. Almost every school will have it somewhere. And so you can kind of gauge where you are based off of those. Another thing to keep in mind is that you are being compared to students applying in your same school or your area. And so, for example, the school I went to was, especially with the IB program, very academic heavy. So our averages, quote unquote, were a little higher than these numbers. But if you're going to a different school where they value, for example, sports more, maybe the people you're competing with don't focus on the SAT or tests as much, and so then your average scores would be lower. So all I'm trying to say is there are a lot of factors that go into these. These average scores are a good benchmark, but there's so many other things to keep in mind as well. And then just to give another chart, same idea, the top 8-ish schools. This is a chart from the Princeton Review of what is a good SAT score. And this gives the 25th to 75th percentile of accepted students. So the average will be somewhere about the middle of that range. And again, these are for highly competitive universities. Okay. So getting into my tips for the SAT, my big tip is that the more you're used to the type of questions I like to ask, the better you'll do. And so, like I mentioned before, it's not just about knowing the content, it's about knowing what kind of questions I like to ask. So that's why if you take practice tests for the ACT and the SAT, you'll realize, yes, they're both testing reading and they're both testing math, but they're testing different parts of each of them. So the best way you can really prep yourself for these exams is to take as many of the official practice tests as possible. So as many of the official College Board practice tests, the one that the ACT themselves roll out, because while test prep centers and test prep books like to give an idea and do their best at guessing what College Board wants, they're not the official place that is actually giving you the exam. So your best bet is going to be to go to the original source. Okay, so if you're not planning on taking the exam in the next few months or even the next year, here are some tips you can keep in mind to still kind of prepare yourself. So one of them is to try and read different types of text outside of your class requirements. So I don't know about your school, but personally for my school, we had very specific texts that we were studying in English. They were pretty much all literary classics. So like the Odyssey, Tom Sawyer, books like that. And in the SAT and ACT, they both like to test different types of texts. They'll give you some really historical texts. They'll give you some more contemporary articles, nonfiction texts. So just keeping up with reading news articles, reading historical and scientific texts, that will definitely help you once you get to the exam. So it's not completely foreign. Another thing is writing in different styles. So similarly, in the same vein, in school, I only wrote analytical essays. And especially for the ACT, that really bit me in the butt because I wasn't used to writing about my own opinion at all. And so practicing different types of writing, whether you're just at home writing creatively or you're writing for your school's paper, just getting involved and practicing writing that way. And the last thing is just to take a practice test early on. Even if you say, yeah, I'm taking the SAT in like 6 months, so I don't have to start hardcore studying yet, you might still want to take a practice test and just see how far you have to go. So what your goal is, see how many points away you are, and then you can kind of gauge when you want to start studying and how much further you have. Okay, so here are my tips kind of in the order that I think you should go through them. So the first thing is to study section by section. So the SAT and the ACT are both extremely long exams. They're like 3 hours and then up to 4 hours if you're doing the essay as well. So when you're first starting out, you really just want to familiarize yourself with the test and get to know the content. So study the math section by itself, study the reading section by itself, etc. The next thing is to figure out your strengths and weaknesses. This is a really big point. Just repeatedly taking tests over and over is not really going to help you. You have to take the test, go over your answers, and figure out what exactly you did wrong. And so mistakes and why people miss points on these exams kind of fall into 3 main categories. One is the content, so like the actual material, do you know what they're testing? The next is timing. A lot of people run out of time. The SAT gives you more time than the ACT, but it still is a very strict test in terms of time restrictions. The last one is carelessness. A lot of people get nervous or they go too fast on exams and they make a lot of careless errors. So figure out which of the 3 categories most of your mistakes lie in, and then you'll know how to proceed. So that goes into my third point, which is to work through practice exams without timing yourself first. So just for the first few weeks that you're prepping for the exam, don't time yourself, just go through. If you get a really, really good score by doing that, then at least you know all the material, right? So you have the ability to answer all the questions. Then what you have to do is just practice your pacing and timing. So slowly start restricting the amount of time that you have to take the exam. That'll be the best strategy for you because you won't be wasting your time going over things you already know. You're mainly just focusing on your weakness, which would be timing. And that was the case for me. And my last tip is to do full practice tests. So this is especially in like the month or the few weeks directly leading up to your exam date. You have to make sure you're sitting and taking these 3-hour exams because you might be able to get a perfect score in each section individually, but we get fatigued, we get tired doing all these 3 sections themselves. So simulate a testing environment, maybe go to the library or go to your room and just take them for like the whole 3 hours in the order that they're going to be tested on. Okay, so I really want to quickly go through each specific section because I have tips that only apply to certain sections. So for the reading section, which was what I personally struggled with the most, even though I say I like English, you have to figure out which reading strategy works for you. So there are like 4 to 5 passages in each section, and it's going to take you a really long time if you thoroughly read every single passage and then thoroughly read all the questions and answers. So practice these 3 different strategies and figure out what works best for you. It could be totally different. For me, what I found worked best after some trial and error was the first one, which is I would skim the passages first. So not reading in depth, just going through it, reading really quickly, then going to the questions and going back to find answers. Because that way I already knew like kind of where I could find these answers, and then I would just pick and choose and pull them out. And that was the fastest way to do it for me. But some other people like to read the questions first, and then they go and read the passage because they know what they're looking for. So if you skim the questions first and then you read the passage and do the questions, that's another strategy. The last one, which I don't really recommend, but potentially could work for you if you're a really fast reader, is to thoroughly read the passage, and then you could potentially answer the questions without really having to go back. But I don't think that strategy works for too many people. It's definitely something you can try out when you're kind of figuring out and testing the waters. Okay, so continuing with some tips for the reading section. These are just things that I wish I would have known and not the most basic tips. But the first one is to make sure you read the introduction blurb and all the footnotes in a passage. So in the SAT, they usually have some introduction with like the author, the era, and the background. And I used to never read those, but some of the answers to questions are directly in those and not in the actual article. So make sure you read those as well as the footnotes. And like the little definitions that they'll sometimes give you under the article. My second tip is to always look for direct evidence. So this is tricky because a lot of the answer choices seem like they make complete sense and they seem absolutely correct. But if you can't find them directly in the text, not word for word, but if you can't find them like in the article mentioned, then that's not going to be the correct answer because they do like to trick you by throwing in answers that make sense but aren't correct for the specific article. And the last one is to figure out what type of reading or text is the hardest for you. So in the SAT, they like to give you a wide variety of articles. So there's usually one like fictional story. There's one historical text that's usually written in Old English, which a lot of people can find more difficult. There's like a nonfiction one, and then there's like a sciencey one that's not like technical science, but it'll be about like animals or about global warming, something like that. So a lot of times people, if you find yourself missing like 5 questions just for one article and then doing fine on the rest of the test, then you'll know like, okay, it was just, I didn't understand that one text. And so you can go back and practice those texts specifically. Okay, so for math, the first one is pretty basic. Just to know all the content before you're doing practice tests. So if you're a rising freshman in high school and you haven't learned Algebra 2 or pre-calculus yet, there's a good chance you won't do well on the exam because you just don't know the content yet. So make sure you kind of go through those lists online and in all the prep books about what types of content you need to know, whether it's trigonometry, whether it's geometry. Just go through that list. If there's anything that doesn't seem familiar, study that before you try doing the test because otherwise it's not going to be worth it. Another thing that I think is really specific to math is to try to answer the question before looking at the answer choices. So with math questions, right, you don't need the answer choices to figure it out. You should be able to answer it as if it was a multiple choice. And I say this because the College Board likes to give answer choices that mimic mistakes that students commonly make. So a lot of times you'll see an answer choice and then your brain will subconsciously guide you to that answer even though it might be incorrect because there is a logical connection. So just trying to answer the question before the answer choices. My next tip is to memorize common formulas. So you do get a formula sheet on both exams, but it's a hassle to keep flipping back and forth. So if you can just know in your head the common formulas of area, of the quadratic formula, etc., that will make it a lot easier for you timing-wise. Always read the question carefully. I think a lot of people don't do this because it's just math. You just see numbers. It's not like reading, but make sure you know exactly what they're asking for each question and don't just gloss over it. The last one is to skip difficult questions, especially with math. A lot of times we can get bogged down spending like 5 minutes to 10 minutes trying to answer one question. It's totally not worth it. If you can't answer it in a couple of minutes, move on, do the rest of them, and then come back because the harder questions aren't worth more points. All the questions are worth equal amounts of points. So it doesn't matter if you answer the easy questions or the hard questions. You just want to answer more correctly. Okay. And the last section, which is writing. And it's called writing, but it's like the grammar section. So one tip that I have is to say these questions out loud in your head, especially if you're a native English speaker. We don't know a lot of the grammar rules. Like they don't like to teach English grammar in K through 12 education, but things just sound right, like certain grammar things. So you can say it in your head to make it easier. Another thing is to at least skim the passage as a whole. So if you've looked at how the writing section is formatted, it's like passages and there's blanks and they pull out questions. If you just read a sentence with a question, you might not know what the whole passage is talking about, and that'll really put you at a disadvantage, especially because there are questions that say, okay, what would be the best title for this article, or what is the best summary of this paragraph? You have to kind of know what the whole thing is talking about. My third bullet point is called the no change answers. So in all of the grammatical questions in the writing section, they'll have like 4 choices and then they'll have no change. And I used to be so scared of picking that answer because I was like, oh, it's a question. There must be something wrong. So I have to pick one of the choices. But there are a few, at least 4 to 5 questions in each exam where the answer is no change, where it's exactly correct as is. And so don't psych yourself out and just not choose those answers. And the last one is a very general tip. Obviously there's exceptions, but in general, if you're stuck between 2 answers that both sound grammatically correct, you want to choose the more concise one. So in this section, they talk a lot about concision. They don't want you going on and adding unnecessary words in your answer. So if there's one answer that's shorter, it's probably the correct one. Okay, so, my bad. Okay, the essay. I really want to briefly talk about this, but not spend too much time on it because most schools do consider the essay optional. Most colleges that you're applying to don't technically require the essay, but some do, so definitely double check before you apply to the college. But my advice is if you're already sitting through and if you're already studying and paying for the first 3 hours of the exam, you might as well take the essay as well. It's an extra hour and it'll help you look better. If you do well, it'll make you look better for a lot of schools. And like we said before, the SAT and ACT essay are very, very different. So if you do some practices and you realize you're significantly better at one than the other, that's what can help you choose between the SAT and the ACT. The last thing is to read a lot of sample essays, right? Online, there's a lot of samples of essays that have scored very well, and practice writing. I used to hate practice writing essays because I would literally have to block out an hour of time, but seriously practice writing the essays and have someone grade it, whether that's your friend, whether that's a college counselor, a school teacher, have someone grade it and give you suggestions. Okay, I'm gonna pause right here because I see some questions. So I'm gonna just go through them really quickly before we continue. Okay, so I'm taking AP Psych at my school, but self-studying for AP Stats. Should I switch? Okay, so in my opinion, obviously it depends on your school, but in my opinion, I would switch because stat is a much harder exam to self-study and it's a lot more difficult content. So for AP Psych, I self-studied the exam in about 2 months. Like I opened my book and I memorized everything. And because it was mostly short-term memory, I only needed about 2 months. But for stat, it was a class that I took in school and I was doing homework for it almost every day and it was a lot of material. So I would recommend it unless if you are really worried about your GPA and you know you won't do well on AP Stat as a class, then that's definitely something to keep in mind too. But if they're kind of the same level for you, then I would suggest doing stat in school. For self-studying a push, okay, so all the US history, US government, world history exams are a lot about memorization. And so definitely I would recommend purchasing an exam book because the AP has very specific things they'd like to test on. So it's not every single piece of history, right? You don't want to be studying things that you don't need to know. And then just double check that you're doing you're up to date, because I know they've changed the exam recently about like the span of years that they test on. I think they kind of shortened it. So you don't want to be studying like super, super early history if you don't have to. Yes, you can take both the SAT and the ACT. Okay, I got a question about school ranks. So my school didn't rank, but I know a lot of schools do. And if your school does rank, they do require that on the college applications for you to say. So it's something they definitely look into, but it's definitely not a huge component. So even if you're not ranked in the top 15%, but you have good grades, if you have good extracurriculars, that's definitely not going to discount you as an applicant. So they do look at it, but it's not a huge deal. Okay, suggested source from where we can read for improving the SAT reading section. So I would definitely suggest taking a look at College Board exams that they've released on their website. And I'll go more into resources after this slide, but just looking at the types of readings they like to ask, a lot of them are actually clippings from articles. So if you want to keep up with current events and just read some news articles, that would be a great place to start. Another thing would be to practice reading Old English, because that's what a lot of people find difficult, is those older English passages. So books like Pride and Prejudice that are more older English, I would suggest reading those as well. Khan Academy, excellent source. That's one of my points on my next slide, is really great tool to study for the SAT. Okay, so Alyssa, I think about the SAT essay ticket situation, definitely talk to College Board about that. It looks like just a technical error. So email your testing site or email College Board and they should be able to help you out with that. How do you figure out if you want to submit scores to SAT on applications if we have them? Okay, I think you're talking about the official score reports, so correct me if you're not talking about that. But on the Common App and all college applications, you're required to self-report your scores. And then a majority of like higher level institutions like top 20 will require you to send in the official score report. So you can double check that on the school's website. For example, UPenn requires you to send in the official scores. Some schools don't require it, but they recommend it. And if schools ever recommend anything, you should do it, because they're really looking for that. They just don't want to require it. But because it does cost money to send scores, if it is a financial burden to you, definitely reach out to the school, reach out to your school counselor. There are a lot of people who can help you with that. Okay, human, geo, and apes. Okay, so like I said before, if you're ever self-studying an AP exam, definitely get a prep book. It's not worth it to get like a class textbook because they test very different things. Usually class textbooks are a lot more comprehensive. So definitely get an AP book. I personally haven't taken those exams, but I know people who have, and I know they aren't like the most difficult exams. So I think it's totally okay to be self-studying them. So good luck. Definitely get a sub prep book, like from Barron's or from Princeton. Should you send your SAT scores to College Board? I kind of answered that earlier. So if your school requires it, you definitely have to. If they recommend it, you probably should. And the thing about sending scores is to do it as early as possible because it takes a long time to get to them for whatever reason. A lot of them are becoming test optional, yeah, because of the pandemic. But if our scores are lower than average of those admitted, should we submit? Okay, that's a really good question. I think you have to consider how much lower it is. If it's roughly the average, then I would say go ahead and submit it. And additionally, a lot of schools are test optional, but unfortunately there are people, like still a lot of people who are going to be submitting test scores. So you don't want to kind of miss out on that opportunity. If you have a lot of things in your application that'll boost you up, for example, if you have really good extracurriculars and things like that, submitting a score won't harm you unless it's very low, which I don't think it is. But if you don't think you have a lot of other things to boost your score or your application overall, then it would be a good idea to submit that. Okay, great. Then I'm going to keep going and we'll get to more questions at the end. So keep them coming. Some resources for studying. Someone mentioned Khan Academy, which I think is the best free resource for studying for the SAT because they've recently become College Board's official partner. What that means is everything that they give you, all the resources are official. So College Board has released at this point 8 official practice SAT tests, and they're all on Khan Academy for free. So don't buy the College Board, like that huge blue book with all the exam practices, because they're all for free online. They also have really great modules, like allowing you to figure out what specifically in content areas you're lacking, and so that's really helpful too. Another thing is the Prep Scholar blog. If you Google almost any question related to college at all, one of the top choices is going to be by the Prep Scholar blog. They have really reputable authors writing and giving you advice about almost any question you could ever have about college admissions. So I'll be sharing this slideshow with you guys afterwards, but everything that's underlined is like a hyperlink, so you can click it and go to the link. And then for not free resources, the first one is exam prep centers and tutors. So I don't think this is necessary by any means. I think you can definitely study for the SAT or the ACT by yourself. But they are a great resource if you need someone guiding you, if you need extra advice, or if you just need someone holding you accountable to study X amount of hours every week. C2 Education, A+ Tutoring, and Prep Scholar has an online program, which would be great right now because of the pandemic, that are all excellent resources. And I'm sure if you ask around, all areas like around the globe have like local test prep centers as well. So even if you go there like just 2 hours every week, it's good to kind of have that consistency in your schedule. And last but not least, the prep books. The Black Book is one that I think is highly underrated, but they have it for both the SAT and the ACT, and I think it's one of the best exam prep books because it gives so many like tips and tricks. It's not just content and practice. And then Barron's, Princeton Review, and the official College Board books are also all good resources. Okay, so I got a question specifically about first generation and low income students. So the first thing I would say to look at is the SAT Test Waiver. On College Board, you can check whether or not you're eligible for it. It's a really quick process. But if you are, they give you 2 free SATs, 6 free subject tests. You can send scores to as many colleges as you want. And that would be really, really helpful if it's something that you are eligible for and something that you need. Another thing is to check in with your school because a lot of schools will offer a free exam for all their juniors in the spring of their junior year. And also your guidance counselor and other teachers might have just resources on hand. The last thing I have just are 2 links for resources and scholarships for students that you can click on when I send out the PowerPoint. Okay, so in terms of sending scores, I just wanted to include this section because I remember being so stressed about it when I got around to applying to colleges. So first of all, the earlier, the better. If you're confident about your score, you can ask for it to be sent like 48 hours after you take the exam for free, which is really good because it costs, I think, $12 to send it afterwards. Another thing is to double check different schools' requirements. We kind of talked about that. And you don't want to have to pay for express shipping, even though it's digital. To get things in within like 2 weeks, you have to pay an extra like $14. You don't want to have to do that. So make sure you try to send it at least like a month before your deadline. Super scoring, if you've heard of this, it's basically when you take the exam on 2 separate sittings, but you can combine the highest score in different sections. So if I got a 700 the first time I took it for math and a 750 the second time I took it, then the 750 would count. So this depends on the school. A lot of schools do allow it, but a lot of schools don't. So that is one of the benefits of retaking exams, is that even if your overall score doesn't improve, but you magically do a lot better on one section, your score that you send to schools can still improve. The last thing is that SAT and ACT scores are sent separate. So yes, you can take both exams. I did take both exams, but you have to separately send them to the schools. So if you don't want to pay to send scores to each school, it's kind of not worth it to take both exams. But if you're just doing it to figure out which one you can get a better score in, go ahead. I ended up getting like a similar score on both exams, like the equivalent, and I had a really hard time deciding which one to send. So that's something to keep in mind. My last little note is that some schools make you send all of your scores. So don't retake a test a million times, because some schools do require you to send all of them, and that doesn't look good if you took the SAT 10 times, right? So that's something to keep in mind that I didn't know either. About retaking, these are just a couple questions I want you to keep in mind if you're thinking of retaking a test. First of all, do you have the time and commitment to study hard to actually increase your score? For the SAT, for example, if you only think you can increase your score by like 10 to 20 points, it's probably not worth it to retake it, because it's extra money, it's extra time that you have to spend. Lastly, were your mistakes mainly careless or content-based? If it's under the wire, you only have 1 month to study and you really just don't know most of the content, that would not be a good reason to retake, because it's so hard to like learn all the new material. And lastly, is it worth it? That's a question you have to ask for yourself, depending on your goals and your score. Okay, so on to subject tests, which is my last little spiel before I get into all the questions. Subject tests, the SAT subject tests, almost all of them are taken your spring to early fall before your senior year. So don't stress about it if you're an underclassman in high school. Some of the exceptions are languages, the 2 math exams, and any subjects that you are willing to self-study. So for example, I know a lot of people who took Chinese in their freshman year because they were already fluent. For math, I took it early because I already finished self-studying all the material because I was in an accelerated math program. And so those are a few exceptions. But for the majority of classes, because SAT subject tests are really hard, like they are not easy exams, it's not recommended to take them until like your junior year of high school. So like with the APs, here's a sample of the SAT subject tests I took. I took math 2 the June of before my junior year, so in my sophomore year. That's because I already finished pre-calculus/trig. So you have to make sure you're learning all the content, or else you're going to have a lot of work to do on your own. And then my June before senior year, I took biology M and Spanish, and then I retook Spanish. It ended up being absolutely unnecessary. Like I raised my score by I think 40 points, but I never really needed that score anyways. So that wasn't necessary. I don't think I needed to do that. But basically I took 3 subject tests. So here's some things to keep in mind. The subject tests aren't like APs where people regularly take like 6 to 8 exams. For most people, they only take 1 to 2. The reason I took 3 was because Georgetown required 3 exams. I really wanted to apply to Georgetown, and they were the only school that required 3 SAT subject tests. So that's why I did that. Another thing is that MIT specifically requires a physics, chemistry, or biology SAT subject test score. So just look at the schools you're applying to, figure out what their requirements are, and then you can kind of figure out what tests you really need to take. Most schools really only require you to take the math SAT subject test. And yeah, don't take any more than you need. There's not really much benefit to these exams. To be honest, most schools don't offer any credit. They're really hard, and because they're scored out of 800, they're hard to get a good score on. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay, and then here is my last slide. It's just general tips for any exam that you're taking. Sleep over studying, staying up late to study. Like, this is a lesson that I learned the hard way so many times over. I would say, okay, I just want to like look over these last few materials the day before my exam because I was really stressed, and then it was like 3 a.m. and I ended up being so tired. So just sleep, getting a good 8 to 10 hours of sleep is way more important. My next suggestion is to bring a watch. Not bringing a watch is what cost me my first SAT exam and why I did so poorly. I assumed that there'd be a clock in the room, which most testing centers will have that, but the clock was in a place that I couldn't see at all, and it was slow, and it totally threw me off. So because timing is such a big part of exams, I would say bring a watch. Do double check your testing restrictions though. You definitely can't bring like an Apple Watch, and a lot of places don't want you to bring a digital watch, but just like a watch so you can keep the time. Bring some snacks and water. I usually don't get hungry, but during exams, because it's 4 hours long, I did get really hungry. Always bring extra materials like pencils and erasers. You never know if your testing center doesn't supply them. And then arrive early, because sometimes there's a huge line, sometimes they close doors early. You never know, so arrive early. Okay, that was really long. I'm sorry if that was longer than we expected, but I'm now going to answer any questions you have, so put them in the chat. I also put my email here if anyone wants to reach out and email me about any questions. I've been helping people apply to college. I've been reading essays, all of that. And then I also have my YouTube channel, which I post like college advice on. Okay, so let's go through some questions. If it's optional, it doesn't matter because for UC, they said they won't take it into account. Yeah, exactly. So the UCs specifically, they were one of the earliest schools to announce becoming test optional. So then it doesn't matter. But a lot of schools like only became test optional because of the pandemic, and they said it so late that most students already have scores. And they're not like the UCs. Like the UCs, I think a lot of them are test optional like forever, but a lot of other schools are only test optional for this year. So you kind of have to figure out which one it is. If you sound good on paper, but your scores are low, will that bring your application down? So I'd say if you have like really good grades, if you have a lot of other strong points of your applications and the school doesn't require the test, don't send in the test, because don't give them any reason to doubt you if you otherwise look really good. So yeah, definitely make sure that they don't need the test though. Okay. How much would you recommend taking the SAT essay? So a lot of schools recommend the essay, like they highly recommend it. So that's why I took it. And I ended up having to retake it because I did poorly in the essay. And that's because I didn't like really prep for it, because I wasn't planning on like studying because I thought I would do fine. So I would recommend taking it unless you're applying to schools that really truly don't care. Then it doesn't matter. But because it's not too much, unless you like also really hate essays maybe, and your school doesn't require it, don't do it. But if it's not a huge burden to you and your school somewhat recommends it, I would say do it. Okay, so this is a good question. If you took the test and you're not happy with your score and you don't send it, will colleges know? So most colleges will not know. They only see the scores that you send them. However, there are schools, like I mentioned before, that will require you to send your entire College Board report. You don't get to choose what tests you send them. So like Yale, for example, I believe, requires you to send everything. In that case, they would see it. And so if you come out of a test room and you know you did poorly, then I would say delete the score. So I think within 48 hours after you take the test, you can have your score deleted and it'll be like it never happened. But once you get your score, there is no way of erasing it from existence. They're going to find out if they want you to send other scores to them. How do you decide what subject tests were most important to take? So Most schools that I was applying to required the math test. So that one was a no-brainer. I took math. And also because I just finished taking the course that directly correlated with that exam, that was an easy decision to make. And then the rest of it was kind of harder. So I didn't want to take the US history SAT subject test that most of my friends took because I was not a fan of history and I knew I wouldn't do that well. So that was on my part. I took the biology M exam because MIT required a science exam and I figured that's the one I could do the best on. So I only took that for one school, which was MIT. And then for Spanish, I knew I needed a third exam for Georgetown, and that was the one that I thought I could do the best on. So it was totally, totally personal preference. If you, for example, are extremely good at history, then go for it. And if you're more so versed in physics, go for it. So it's personal preference. I'd say the only one that most people recommend taking is math. Yes, I will be sharing the slides afterwards. Can I share my scores? Yeah, I can share my scores. So the first time I took the SAT, I got a 1550, and then it was split 750, 800. The next time I took it, I also got a 1550, but it was split 760, 800. So my super score ended up being 1560. So it's higher, quote unquote, than the average for a lot of schools, but honestly, within my school and my community, it was not a very high score, which is totally dependent on my school's environment. And again, I got the same technical score on both times that I took it. It's just that my super score was higher, so it was worth retaking. And then on the ACT, I got a 35. So the ACT scored out a 36. So the 15, 16, and 35 are honestly like the same level if you do like comparison charts. So that's kind of where I was at. For me, testing my scores were never the biggest part of my application, at least what I think. I always knew that my strongest parts were going to be my extracurriculars and my internships and my experience. But I did spend a lot of time preparing for the SAT and the ACT. I'm just personally not very well versed in standardized testing, which is why I accumulated all these tips and advice. Okay, I know that was a lot of information. So any last questions that anyone has? If you don't feel comfortable chatting it to everyone, you can directly chat it to me. But I do hope this was helpful. Again, if you are a freshman or a sophomore, don't stress about these yet. I really didn't start worrying about these until like my summer before junior year. And after that, it's really just about, you have to put in the work. Like it's not something that you can just be talented at. No one's really talented at these things. You have to put in the work and you have to study. But if you are applying to college this year, you're in luck because so many schools are test optional. If tests just aren't your thing, this is a perfect year for you to be applying to college. When will the first recording be up? Well, I'll talk to Femme For Education after this, but the recordings take like 30 minutes to download after they're taken, and so they should be available pretty soon after that. So I'd say later today. Okay, yeah, I know it's a few minutes past, but any last questions that anyone has? Okay, well, you can always reach out and email me. I'm currently not doing anything. I'm doing school online from home this semester, so I definitely have a lot of time to help anyone that needs it, so you can always reach out that way. But I hope this was helpful. Best of luck to all of you. I know it's a difficult process, but yeah, good luck. I think you guys will totally do fine. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And there's more webinars. Definitely sign up for more webinars. They're all run by amazing, amazing people. And yeah, you're welcome. I will be at the next panel about competitive schools, a whole other topic.
Thank you so much, Valerie.
Of course. All right. Bye.
Okay, bye.